History was over because the world was converging towards societies of democratic capitalism. Now, in Our Posthuman Future, Mr. Fukuyama explains why biotechnology has brought about what he calls the recommencement of history. The new book takes on three general areas of concern: gene manipulation, neuropharmacology, and life extension, fearing that advances in biotechnology may end up altering human nature. This program is an hour.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome. Tonight I have the pleasure of introducing Dr. Francis Fukuyama, who will speak of our post-human future. I must confess, everything I know about the future I learned when I was growing up from reading science fiction at my branch of the Free Library. But that's not what Dr. Fukuyama will discuss with us tonight. He was born in Chicago in 1952. He received his BA in Classics from Cornell and his PhD in Political Science from Harvard. He was a member of the Political Science Department of the Rand Corporation from 79 to 80, then again from 83 to 89, and from 95 to 96. He has also served as a member of the policy planning staff of the U.S. Department of State, first as a regular member specializing in Middle East affairs, and then as Deputy Director for European Political Military Affairs. Later, he was a member of the U.S. delegation to the Egyptian-Israeli talks on Palestinian autonomy. Dr. Fukuyama has written widely on issues relating to questions concerning democratization and international political economy. His writing focuses on the role of culture and social capital in modern economic life, and on the social consequences of the transition into an information economy. His first book, The End of History and the Last Man, was published in 1991 and made the bestseller lists in the United States, France, Japan, and Chile. This controversial book was awarded the Los Angeles Times Book Critics Award in the category of current interest, as well as the Premio Capri for the Italian edition. Trust, the social Future and the Creation of Prosperity was published in 1995, and The Great Disruption, Human Nature and the Reconstitution of Social Order followed in 1999. Today, Dr. Fukuyama is the Bernard Schwartz Professor of International Political Economy at the Paul H. Nitze School of Advanced International Studies at Johns Hopkins University. He is a member of the President's Council on Bioethics and is on the advisory boards for the National Endowment for Democracy, the National Interest, the Journal of Democracy, and the New American Foundation. He is a member of the American Political Science Association, the Council on Foreign Relations, the Pacific Council on International Policy, and the Global Business Network. He is here tonight to talk with us about his new book, Our Posthuman Future, Consequences of the Biotechnology Revolution. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Francis Fukuyama.
Well, thank you very much for that very kind introduction. I'm really grateful to the Free Library for hosting me this evening. You may be wondering why someone with my resume is writing a book about biotechnology, which is a question I've asked myself. So I thought I might begin by explaining a bit about the origins of this book. I wrote an article back in 1989 entitled The End of History, which then became the book The End of History and the Last Man. This was a book about history with a capital H, that is to say the progress of human civilization through various stages of history, and the thesis was that it seemed to be directional, and at the end of the 20th century we had ended up in a situation where the end, not end in terms of finish, but end in terms of goal, seemed to be a set of institutions that pointed in a single direction, that is to say liberal democracy in the political sphere and market-oriented capitalism as a form of economics, and that any society that sought to be modern really had to adopt those kinds of institutions if they were going to prosper, that the other major alternatives had all fallen away by the end of the 20th century. Now, this was, of course, a very controversial hypothesis when it was first introduced. And of all of the various criticisms that were raised, the one that seemed to me was not really answerable was one written by a reviewer whose review I actually cannot find at the moment, and whose name I cannot remember, but seemed to be quite decisive, which is that you cannot, in my view, my account of history, the basic driver of this historical process was the progress of modern natural science and the technology that it spawned. And that, one of the reasons that we'd ended up with liberal democracy and market-oriented capitalism was that technology in the late 20th century was actually quite friendly to these kinds of institutions. The information technology revolution democratized life. It, instead of centralizing political control, tended to spread it out. It gave ordinary people access to information, and therefore sponsored the kinds of political values that led to what were, in my view, fairly decent political institutions. But technology is not necessarily friendly to, good political values, and it could be that we were on the cusp of a very major wave of technological innovation that might have different political consequences. Actually, in 1999, on the 10th anniversary of that first article, I was asked by Owen Harries, the editor of The National Interest, which was the journal where I had published that original article, to do a retrospective. And I started thinking about whether it might be the case that a different form of technology, that is to say biotechnology, would have a very different kind of political impact. In a certain sense, the reason why I think we've ended up with liberal democracy in the 20th century was that you had a couple hundred years of social and political experiments by utopian revolutionary movements that sought to remake human societies on a perfectly just basis by completely restructuring the nature of society. In my view, all of them failed, beginning with the French Revolution, but going through the Bolshevik and Chinese and Cambodian revolutions. All of these revolutions failed for one essential reason, because they ran into this brick wall called human nature. That all of the revolutionaries began with a model of human nature or human behavior that was not realistic. Marxism, for example, presumes that, as Marx says, man is a species being, that is to say, he or she has unlimited, well springs of altruism for other human beings at a species-wide level. And this is simply not true. Human beings actually prefer kin and close friends, and they will be altruistic towards a much smaller group of people, but they will not be altruistic towards the heroic Vietnamese or Cuban people simply on abstract grounds. And if you abolish private property, you try to control the family and subordinate all of those to a egalitarian state, it's not going to work, because people will simply not behave in the way that you expect them to. And they tried through various very crude technologies like agitprop and labor camps and re-education to get the square peg of human nature pounded into this particular round hole, and at the end of the 20th century it had all failed and people had largely given up. Now, supposing that you have a technology that is much better than that, that is based on a scientific understanding, for example, of the human brain, on a modern cognitive neuroscience, that has at its disposals much more powerful tools than labor camps and re-education, wouldn't that lead to different possibilities for social engineering and social control? So this was the starting point where I began this, and this is why I began thinking about biotechnology and what potential political consequences it may have. Now, I'm going to talk about 4 pathways to the future that I think are opened up by the biotech revolution. Let me say at the outset that I am not at all against biotechnology. It has tremendous therapeutic promise. With the discovery of stem cells, you have the possibility for the first time of regenerative medicine, where you can actually recreate tissues, including neurons in the brain that we at one point thought simply could not be recreated after early childhood. You have the possibility of curing many of the major diseases, cancers and heart disease, and a number of other scourges of mankind. And I think that this, I would be the last to deny the promise of this. However, I think that one of the problems with this technology is that there are some bad things or questionable things that are all wrapped up in the good things that biotechnology brings. And in that sense, it's very different from nuclear weapons. The moment the first nuclear weapon exploded in the desert in New Mexico, in Alamogordo, people understood right away that this was a very terrible power that had been unleashed on the world, and they tried to control it then, very carefully. With biotechnology, I think the problems are much more subtle, and they're all mixed up with the good things that it is going to bring, and that's why it is much more problematic. Now, let me lay out these 4 pathways to the future. The 4 of them are, first, a revolution in simply our cognitive understanding of genetic causation. The second has to do with neuropharmacology. The third has to do with life extension. And the fourth has to do with genetic engineering. Most people associate the biotech revolution only with the last basket, or the last pathway. That is to say, the ability to actually manipulate the DNA in an embryo that will then, specify the genetic profile of the child that's created subsequently. And what I would like to argue is that may be the most powerful of the technologies that is over the horizon, but that it's only part of this revolution that is unfolding and that we are actually in the midst of. So let me go over these one at a time. Let's begin with the cognitive revolution in our understanding of how genes affect behavior. There's been of course, a 2,000-year debate over nature versus nurture. And the pendulum has swung in very dramatic ways over the past 100 years. After Darwinism, in the late 19th century, you had the rise of a lot of genetic theories of behavior where social status and your position in the global hierarchy were said to be determined by your genes. This was the period of Herbert Spencer and Madison Grant and people who created a theory of what's now called scientific racism, in which they tried to argue using scientific language that in fact the existing political and social hierarchies around the world were genetically determined. And this was a period where Western countries also passed eugenics laws in order to weed out low IQ people and the like. This process was defeated really by a lot of empirical research by people like the great anthropologist Franz Boas at Columbia in the 1920s and 30s, but was really ended by Hitler, because the eugenics policies that the Nazis carried out so discredited people and so horrified people at the idea that genes should be so determinative, as Hitler argued, that the pendulum then swung dramatically over in the middle of the 20th century towards theories that said that society and environment were the causes of behavior, and genes had almost nothing to do with the way that we are. This is a school, if you want, of social constructionism, where people are regarded to be almost infinitely plastic. You can make whatever you want of them through socialization and the like. Someone like the behaviorist B.F. Skinner thought this didn't just apply to human beings. Even pigeons could be made to recognize themselves in the mirror if you just gave them the right incentives and so forth. Now, what's very interesting about the intellectual history of the last 50 years is that pendulum has swung back towards the genetic causation side, not all the way, but an important part of the way, partly as a result of molecular biology, where we now understand the function of DNA and genes in the creation of human beings, but also coming out of other fields like behavior genetics, in which there's now a scientific way to understand the degree of genetic causation. Now, this information is extremely controversial because people basically do not want to be told that there are genetic limits on what they can do, or that there are really genetic causes to important aspects of behavior. If you recall, in 1993, Charles Murray and Richard Herrnstein published a book called The Bell Curve, in which they argued first that intelligence was about 70% inherited, and secondly that black-white differences in intelligence or measured IQ, that some important component of that could be traced to genes, which of course caused a firestorm and a lot of charges that they were reviving scientific racism and the like. Now, the truth of the matter is, I think, the bell curve, I think, was wrong on both counts. It actually led to a very useful review within the discipline of psychology as to what is known about intelligence. And I think the consensus within that discipline right now would say that, in fact, intelligence is something like 40 to 50% inherited. This is on the basis of these so-called from behavior genetics, studies of so-called monozygotic twins, where you get two twins from the same egg that have the identical, set of genes, and you put them in different environments, and you see how different their behavior is as a result. And as a result of the statistical analysis of this kind of study, intelligence is actually not 70% inherited, it's more like 40 to 50%. And I think most people think that racial differences are almost entirely environmental rather than being caused by genes. Nonetheless, even saying that it's 50% genes, I think does not sit well with a lot of people. There are other types of studies, for example, linking genes to crime. I mean, prima facie, it would seem obvious there's got to be a genetic causation there, because the vast bulk of all crimes in all societies, and for as long as we know historically, have been done by young men, young males between the ages of about 15 and 30. And this is invariant across society, so it would be very, I think very surprising if there was not a genetic component to this. But again, the attempt, because it's linked to race and a lot of other controversial issues, it's very hard to, even to study this kind of phenomenon. Now, what's going to happen in the future is that these kinds of results that are currently based on behavior genetics, on these twin studies, is increasingly going to be replaced by molecular biologists finding a direct molecular pathway between a certain set of genes and a certain set of higher order human behaviors, in which we will have a much more certain causal knowledge of what genes cause what effects. Now, this does not mean that environment and upbringing and socialization go away as important factors in what we are as human beings. But it does mean that there is this irreducible genetic component, and once you start understanding what those causal pathways are, you open up the possibility of then being able to manipulate that technologically. And a lot of what we're going to find that will come out of the life sciences, not out of some, kind of ideological social science, but I think out of fairly hard, disciplines like molecular biology, may tell us things that we are not going to really want to hear about the nature of genetic causation. Now, let's move on to the second pathway, which has to do with neuropharmacology. Freudianism, I think, has really disappeared in large measure as a result of basically the rise of drugs and the understanding of the biochemical bases of human brain activity. And of course, there's been a big revolution in the way that mental disease is treated through the emergence of drugs like Prozac and Zoloft or Paxil to treat depression, drugs like Ritalin to treat diseases like ADHD. These are based on a much more precise understanding of neurotransmitters. Serotonin, Prozac, for example, is a selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor. Turns out that serotonin is actually a very political kind of neurotransmitter because it is very much related to feelings of self-esteem. For example, in dominance hierarchies, if you have a monkey that wins alpha male status in a troop of monkeys, he will have elevated levels of brain serotonin. And that they are able to bring about very dramatic effects, very sharp changes in personality, which get very much to our notions of what, identities. I mean, people that were very self-effacing or even self-destructive become, very self-confident as a result of taking a selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor. You also have the possibility of social control through drugs that did not exist previously. Ritalin, I think, is a good example. Attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, ADHD, is actually not a disease in the sense that there's a pathogen that causes some pathological condition in the brain. What it is basically is a description of a normal distribution of behaviors, and when you get far enough out into that tail of behaviors related to, being able to concentrate and sit still, particularly if you're a young boy in a second grade classroom, you are diagnosed as having this condition called ADHD, and you're prescribed Ritalin. The diagnostic criteria that doctors use is actually fairly imprecise, and it's imprecise because, in fact, there's no clear cutoff point. When you get far enough out into that tail, at a certain point, your behavior becomes sufficiently disruptive that you can't function normally. But in fact, Ritalin is, in my view, actually overprescribed for a lot of people who could actually be treated through simply parents and teachers sitting down with them and trying to find interesting things for them to do, and to do things that we traditionally associated with building character. But what Ritalin gives you is, in a way, a medical shortcut around that. I mean, I don't dispute that there are very important therapeutic uses of this drug, but in other cases, it's simply a medical shortcut that parents and teachers find convenient because, in fact, they're too busy or they don't have the time to build character in traditional ways. And again, it has very interesting implications because it comes closer than any other drug I know to being an overt agent of social control, not on the part of the centralized, tyrannical state, but simply in terms of schools and parents and local communities trying to shape, the behavior. Now, it has moral implications because I think, again, it gets at our, ideas of character and identity. One of the popular books written about Ritalin in the last decade is entitled "It's Nobody's Fault," which is to say, it relieves people in a certain category where you actually could use traditional methods of character building, but it says, no, in fact, you have this disease, and the only reason you're suffering from it is you're not taking this drug to, to cure it. This is only the tip of the iceberg. I think that almost everything that people expect to have happen as a result of genetic engineering, improved intelligence, memory, a greater threshold in being able to endure pain, being able to get along without sleep, almost all of these things are going to be achieved through new drugs that will be coming online in the next decade, much sooner than they're going to be coming about through genetic, any kind of genetic manipulation, which actually I think is further away than many people believe. The third pathway has to do with life extension. Let me just describe the current situation in the world now with regard to the existing advances in public health coupled with changes in fertility that have been brought on by earlier innovations, technological innovations in biomedicine, including things like the birth control pill. As a result of falling fertility and the fact that as a result of prior public health measures, people are living longer, the age distribution in virtually every developed country is shifting very dramatically. Countries like Germany, Italy, Japan, Spain are all down now at total fertility rates, that is the average number of children per woman per lifetime, of something like 1.1 or 1.2. The replacement rate is about 2.2 to 2.3. This means at that rate that these societies are losing over 1% of population every year, year in and year out. They'll lose 30% of their native-born population every generation. It also means, because of longer lifespans, that in a country like Italy in the year 2050, by the UN Population Office's estimates, the median age is going to be close to 60. That means 60% of the population is going to be 60 years old or older, which is a completely unprecedented situation for a human society to be in. Now, all of this is going to be true, making no assumptions about future gains in longevity or increases in lifespan. And I think that one of the safest predictions you can make about what's going to happen over the next 50 years is that the cumulative effect of advances in biomedicine are going to increase the number of people that live to later ages. In fact, although this is controversial, there are certain molecular biologists that believe that there's a common genetic source for aging, which in theory could be overcome, which means that, most of the advances in health have been curing people of diseases that then allow more people to reach their natural lifespans, but nothing has been done thus far to increase natural lifespans. But that might not be a limit that we need observe in the future. And you could conceivably, there are people that speculate you could have a doubling or tripling of lifespans, so, people routinely living into their 150s or even later. Now, this, it seems to me, is a perfect example of a biotech innovation that is individually desirable and rational, but is going to be socially disastrous. And for a number of reasons. We're already living in the middle. Actually, it's not as bad for us as it is for a country like Germany or Japan, but in the midst of a very grave social security crisis, because a country like Japan is going to go from about 4 active workers for every retired person now to 2 workers for every retired person in the year 2020. And similarly, you're going to get these distributions where it's going to be increasingly difficult to support older populations. That's, I think, fairly well understood. There are political effects as well. Europe is depopulating itself. It's going to have a median age that is going to reach up into the 50s and 60s in the next couple of generations, and it's at the same time surrounded by parts of the third world whose median age is down where it's always been through the rest of human history, meaning 21, 22. And economically, it is going to be very difficult for societies to keep shrinking in terms of population, and so the only solution for them is going to be to import workers, and they're going to import workers from third world countries that are very culturally different from themselves. Now, Pat Buchanan has written this awful book called The Death of the West, where he's actually accurate in his demographic statistics. He's completely wrong, I think, in what's going to happen, because he argues they ought to keep, somehow raise fertility for native-born white populations and then keep all of the third world immigrants out. That's not possible. And I think that the success of any society in this kind of situation is going to be, dependent on their ability to assimilate culturally different immigrants into, their native-born populations and to manage all of the conflicts that will result from this. You already saw in France the Jean-Marie Le Pen of the Front National coming in second in the French presidential election. The Vlaams Bloc, this guy Pim Fortuyn in the Netherlands that was just assassinated. There are already very powerful backlash movements as a result of this kind of shift in the demographic balance, and that's only going to get worse particularly in Western Europe. Well, Japan is a different case because they simply don't allow immigrants in, which has got its own set of problems. But all of these countries are going to face, for very basic biological reasons, are going to face very important internal political problems. If you think about how our society is going to work under conditions of dramatically increased lifespans, you just look around our society and notice how many age-graded hierarchies there are. In corporations, in universities, boards of trustees, you generally have this pattern where your status and income rise as your age rises, which makes sense in terms of accumulating human capital and the like. But if you get into a situation where people are routinely being healthy and working not just as now into their 60s and 70s, but on up into their 80s and 90s, you then have this situation where great-grandfathers and great-grandmothers will be competing against their great-grandchildren for the same job. Those hierarchies, that now look like pyramids will open up into trapezoids or even rectangles, and you will have now the prospect of intergenerational competition of a sort that has really never existed in human history previously. And so you'll have to have a very dramatic social revolution in a certain sense, where people will have to fall off of these ladders, these status ladders, and start over again, at different stages in their lives. The other thing that I think will happen is that progress in innovation and adjustment to change conditions is going to slow down dramatically. The economists have a saying that the discipline of economics progresses one funeral at a time, which is actually true not just of economics, but unfortunately of quite a lot of other areas of life. And the reason, I think, is pretty straightforward. People develop their Weltanschauung, their general worldview, by the time they're about 25 or 30, and thereafter it's pretty rare to have it change. It can change in individuals, but by and large, what shapes a person when they are young tends to shape their worldview thereafter. This is why politics is generational, why you have Tom Brokaw's Greatest Generation, followed by the baby boomers, followed by Generation X, each of which was shaped by a different set of life conditions at the time that they were growing up. And in many respects, politics doesn't move on until physically one generation has replaced another generation. I mean, in Russia today, the only people that vote communist are people over the age of 65. Because that was the condition, under which they grew up. And so, in many respects, the ability of societies to adjust to different changing conditions has been, historically dependent on the fact that one generation naturally succeeds another. And if you interrupt that natural cycle, you will have very, I think, unpredictable, but potentially fairly serious consequences on the ability of societies to adapt. Now, the final issue has to do with genetic engineering per se, which is where you do to a human being what they currently do to plants. That is to say, you take an embryo and you snip out a series of genes and you replace them with other genes. The genes don't have to come from other human beings. They could come from a jellyfish, which is what they do in certain types of agricultural biology, or another species altogether. Now, as I said, this is not done currently. The hope is, excuse me, at least initially, that many genetically linked diseases like Huntington's or cystic fibrosis or sickle cell anemia can actually be cured. The genetic predisposition can be cured by snipping out the particular gene that gives you this condition and replacing it with another. At the moment, the only way you can do this is by what's called pre-implantation genetic diagnosis, where a couple has a series of embryos and you can screen the embryos for a particular genetic condition and then implant the one that has the right set of genes. And in fact, there was a case earlier this year where a woman with early onset Alzheimer's did that. She had her embryos screened and picked one that did not have her particular genetic condition and had that implanted back in her womb. So that is something that is already happening. The actual manipulation of genes is much further down the road. Now this is, I think of all of these technologies, the most consequential, because once you alter a person's genome, that's it. It's like giving them a permanent tattoo that cannot be erased. And not only that, it's one that is going to be handed down to all of your successive descendants. These are the consequences of what is called germline engineering. And this is what I think people associate with things in the future like designer babies, where people will be able to pick not just therapeutic results like not having these genetically linked diseases, but being able to have kids that are more intelligent or taller or better looking or whatnot. Now, in my view, this is pretty serious stuff when you talk about moving out of the area of therapy into the area of enhancement. And the simple reason for that is that, in my view, human rights, our very notions of right and wrong, are very much linked to human nature. We assign ourselves dignity as human beings because we possess a certain set of characteristics as a species, like the capability for language, for reason, for moral choice, the ability to organize and interact with each other in society, a certain gamut of emotions, typically human emotions, that are the source of our humanity, and that constitute the essence of what we regard as necessary to give people dignity and therefore political rights. This is a very fragile thing. If you think about, Thomas Jefferson, towards the end of his life in 1824, wrote a letter in which he said, we can expect the spread of progress in these United States because nature has not conspired to make certain people born with saddles on their backs and other people born booted and spurred to ride them. That is to say that political equality in a nation dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal is dependent on the empirical fact of natural human equality. And if you think about our political history, when Jefferson wrote those words about all men being created equal in 1776, African Americans and women, in fact, were not equal. They did not have the right to political participation. And the reason that they didn't have that right was that they were believed not to be basically full human beings. They didn't possess, sufficient intelligence, or they didn't have the right emotional characteristics, or some other set of conditions that excluded them from political participation. And one of the great achievements of 20th century politics has been to widen that circle of creatures that have political rights to encompass basically the entire human species. And that was driven by a scientific realization that, in fact, the variation between genders, between ethnic groups, between different human races was, in fact, not all that great. We are a relatively homogeneous species. Now, in theory, germline engineering in the long run will potentially give us the ability to create people metaphorically born with saddles on their backs or others born booted and spurred. I think that many people anticipate problems. When you have designer babies, the first people that are going to make use of this technology are elites who are then going to try to embed their social advantages genetically in their children, which will then create a class of enhanced people and a class of unenhanced people. But you could have a much more, something that amounts almost to speciation, where you actually get genetically different groups of people. Musicians, enhance the musical ability of their children. Athletes enhance the athletic ability, and the like. And I think that a lot of people, particularly a lot of libertarians, look forward to this time when they'll be able to, go ahead and, turn themselves into cyborgs or whatnot. But I think that they do not understand the seriousness, the political seriousness of doing something like this, because, in fact, the nature of our rights very much, depends on our natures. And if you undermine that basic, principle of the homogeneity of the species, you are going to inevitably affect the nature of rights themselves. Now that's the different pathways. The last part of my book talks about what to do about all of this, and I have a very simple solution. You just regulate biotechnology. As a result, I think, of the information technology revolution, a lot of people have tended to think that technology is unstoppable, that first of all, it is illegitimate to try to regulate technological advance, and even if it were legitimate to do it, you can't do it because, it'll move to a different jurisdiction or you'll hold back progress or whatnot. Now, I think that in general, we are not talking at all about stopping technology. I don't think there's any way to stop the accumulation of scientific knowledge, and I don't think that that is desirable, but it is certainly the case that you can direct the development of technology towards aims that are humanly, that enhance human flourishing, and you can try to limit the uses of technology that are a threat to human values. We do this all the time. We do this in drug regulation. We do this with regard to nuclear weapons, with regard to toxic waste, with regard to environmental degradation. I mean, there are a whole lot of areas in which things that are technologically possible to do, we refrain from doing because they do not promote human values and human flourishing. And I think in the case of biotechnology, you can set up institutions that will do the same thing, that will promote therapeutic uses of technology, but that will put that as a priority over, let's say, the enhancement uses or other uses that are more controversial or that raise important ethical dilemmas. I think maybe I will stop there. I can talk a lot more about a lot of other subjects, including, whether we're really at the end of history or whether this is the only problem with history being over. But I guess at this point I would like to invite any comments or questions you have. Thank you. Thank you.
Great. We will certainly take questions now, and I think many of you know that we will have people in each of the aisles, volunteers with microphones, and I'll call on you, and we would like you to wait until a microphone gets there so that we can make sure that everybody can hear the question, and we have one person asking a question at a time. And okay, let's go with the person you have right here, and then the hand right here. Great.
What implications do you see in the birth rate situation and the groups coming in from less developed countries in the difference between the U.S. approach to integration of these into our society versus European?
Well, the United States is not going to suffer from the same kind of falling population as Europe and Japan will, because we have a higher fertility rate for our native-born population, and then we have a high rate of immigration. And so, in fact, I think most estimates show our population rising over time. So the scenario that faces Europe is not one that we are going to have, but it is because I think we permit immigration. Now, I have in general been a proponent of immigration, but I think it's not an unproblematic issue, because unless you have assimilation of culturally different people and a sense of shared citizenship and a certain minimal set of shared values, then you're going to get very deep conflicts, political conflicts within the larger society that I think even the United States and its relatively strong political institutions are going to have trouble dealing with. But I do think that that's a challenge that we are much more likely to handle better than the Germans or the Japanese or the French or other developed countries.
Okay. Yes, right here, sir.
What do you make of Ray Kurzweil's vision of the future of the amalgamation of human and computer technology into a whole new species and life form? I assume you're familiar with
this
it.
is
As a
right.
matter
Ray,
of fact, he spoke right here.
Yeah, he
about
spoke here a couple of years ago,
That's
eh?
correct, yes.
Well, I guess I've never really been persuaded that this man-machine interface. First of all, I think it's a lot further off than he would suggest. The other thing about the whole artificial intelligence community, however, is that they take this very reductionist view of the human brain. I mean, they say, well, it's just a wet computer and it's maybe now a couple orders of magnitude more complex than the most complex machine, silicon machine. But when that silicon machine, down the road gets up to this level of complexity, then it'll be able to do everything that a human brain can do. And I just think that, I don't know what they're smoking. I mean, if they think that that's the case, because among other things, you have this problem of consciousness. Human beings are conscious. They have subjective feelings. They have emotions. And that somehow emerges out of this, complex wet computer we have. They don't have the faintest idea of, even what the ontological status of thoughts and emotions are. And no theory whatsoever as to, how they evolved over evolutionary time, why they exist in human beings, and this idea that, and because they begin with this very reductionist, materialist understanding of how the brain works, they assume that, once you build a complex enough computer, bingo, you've got, a human brain. And I just think that that's, we don't even begin to understand, how we complete human beings with consciousness and emotions and subjective feelings, come into existence. And so I don't feel that there's much of a threat from that quarter, coming up.
Okay, interesting. Yes, let's have, please raise your hand. We have a person here. Then we'll go to the gentleman there. We'll come to this one, and then we'll go back there again. Hope I remember all that.
Your projections, reasonably enough, are based on society as it exists and projected trends in technology. I wonder if you have considered the situation which the CDC and the World Health Organization, these are not alarmist organizations, have been agitating about for a while. You remember what happened with the bubonic plague in the 14th century and the flipping over of society as a consequence of that. What would you project is going to be the outcome of multiple antibiotic resistance in the society, flipping us into an age of pre-antibiotic disease on your projections?
I'm not an epidemiologist and I'm not a scientist, period. So I can't really tell you anything meaningful about that. I had a study group in Washington a while back in which we invited several speakers on this topic, and a lot of them actually thought that we were going to be able to keep this under control because the rate at which these bacteria mutated, could basically be met if there was simply more investment in new antibiotics, and so that wasn't a race that we necessarily had to lose. But it is a one possible scenario. But I'm not the right person to ask about that.
Okay.
In your lecture, you mentioned an end to.
If you could stand up,
Sure.
it would help all of us. It would help the two of us up here to
sure.
know who's speaking because of the glare of the lights. Thank you very much.
In your lecture, you mentioned an end to Freudian analysis, and in the answer prior to this last question, you mentioned a certain subjectivity to the brain's wet computer, which precludes my questioning you about what went wrong with Colin Ferguson, who was taking selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors. But more, which focuses my question now, I work in a psychiatric hospital. I have a particular adolescent who, at 14 years old, has a psychotic dysfunction with manic episodes. What, as far as the pathways that you mentioned, would you see? Most immediately, I'm sure it's just chemical, pharmacological. But what of those pathways would you see as a means of accessing her unique brand of intelligence, her unique information processing skill set? I mean, what do you see for psychiatric hospitalization in general, specifically that case?
Well, I mean, I would assume that a lot of seriously ill, people with serious mental disorders like that, have been treated pharmacologically. I mean, that's what, that's what I was referring to with the decline of Freudian talk therapy, that it turned out that, Freudians didn't have anything better than a 50% batting average in with regard to therapy, whereas a lot of drugs have been actually quite effective in treating certain forms of severe schizophrenia, psychosis, and the like. It's not a lot of these diseases are not fully treatable, but at least the biological component of them has to some degree been isolated and therefore is treatable. My suspicion, however, is that human beings being the kind of complex interactions of both biology and environment, that there's still room for the talk therapy as well, because I would think that in addition to fixing the the biological substrate, that there's also a psychological layer that needs to be addressed through environment and social interaction and the like. With regard to any specific patient, though, I couldn't tell you what what would be the best approach.
Okay, now we have I wanted to come down here. If we could, yes, if you could bring the microphone down to the gentleman in the center, and then we'll go back there, and then we'll start a new round. I see some more hands up. No, you go ahead. We'll adjust the microphone.
Okay. I find your argument about life extension fascinating. But coming to think about it, it's not really about genetic manipulation. Europe and Japan are unpopulating themselves because of normal standard medicine, whether these are medications or other forms of treatment. So maybe your argument is wider than the way you presented it here, and it is we're spending too much on life extension, which is, as you said, individually beneficial and desirable, but socially might be destructive. Maybe this is the complete argument.
Well, quite frankly, I think that the advances in public health that have occurred up to this point have already put us in something of a crisis, because people are living to later ages, but at greater stages of debility. I mean, for example, if you want to know why there's been this big explosion of Alzheimer's, it's because it's a degenerative age-related disease, and the incidence of it simply goes up in proportion to your how old you are, the likelihood that you will get it. And so part of the reason that you have this increased incidence of Alzheimer's is because people are not dying of heart attacks and cancers and other types of diseases. And if you've ever spent a lot of time in a nursing home, which I unfortunately have had to do in the last couple of years, it's a very it's not a pretty picture. And so I think that the overall effects of advances in biomedicine are actually a bit more ambiguous than a lot of people assume. I mean, people tend to think anything that can put off disease, that can cure disease, that can extend life is automatically a good thing. And for many people, the value of doing that trumps, virtually any other kind of consideration. And I would just say that although, I certainly don't want to die prematurely, and I would like to be cured of whatever, afflictions affect me, I'm not sure that cumulatively that always leaves us, as a society better off. And I think you're right that it doesn't have to await these new technologies. I mean, to some extent, we're already living with some of the consequences of past advances in biomedicine.
Okay. Yes. Please stand so we can see who's asking the question.
Yeah, you talked about the socialization of the immigrants coming in, and it seems to me that that's the same issue as the socialization of kids who are being put on Ritalin. I agree with you totally inappropriately in many cases. So the question I have is, how do we deal with this issue of everybody's got to act exactly the same? This seems to be ingrained in our society, and I would hesitate to try to make an answer, but maybe you can.
Well, look, I think that any society, particularly a pluralistic, democracy like we live in, has to be a certain mixture of community and individualism, and our society tends to tilt very much towards the individualism side. We promote, difference and diversity and the like. However, there are certain types of diversity that, you can't live with politically. I mean, the Balkans is a wonderfully ethnically diverse place, but it's also not, a very healthy place, to grow up, or it's not a very healthy political community. And so I think what you need is to put diversity within certain, limits of shared, cultural understandings that permit people, even as they are different, both as individuals or as races or as ethnic groups, to share certain common characteristics. Now, we in the United States have a big advantage because our sense of citizenship is a political one. It's not related to blood and soil or to ethnicity or race or religion. And so it is possible for us to, have a set of institutions that we can be loyal to, that is indifferent to where we came from and, what our background is. But I do think that you need to put some limits on that, the kind of, permissible diversity, so that, for example, I mean, just to make this concrete, I think that, having the same language is a big, is a big advantage. And for that reason, I would think that, something like bilingualism is not helpful in that process of cultural assimilation. And if you can get away with having a monolingual society, you really ought to invest in doing things like that.
Okay. All right. Now let's have some more questions. I see Mr. White, who I know well because he is the chair of the Friends of the Free Library.
Hi, Elliot. Professor, I have one question. The basic assumption you're making is a fairly optimistic assumption. I mean, regulate. But I'm aware of Tuskegee. I'm aware of the birth control testing in third world populations, formula testing in third world populations. I'm aware of, in Pennsylvania, gas being put in a tunnel and people driving through, longitudinal studies. So we have powerful tools for the future, but evil exists amongst us. And so your question of regulation is to some extent simplistic. How do you regulate the military? How do you regulate secrecy in corporations who are not bound by a set of ethics, given the history of these advances being acted out in third world populations?
Well, look, no regulatory system is perfect. And so people will always evade, regulation. But that doesn't mean that regulation doesn't work, or it's, impossible, or that you can't, take an existing set of regulations and enforce them, or, modify them to make them more, effective. And if you don't believe this, you ought to go to a developing country that does not have a functioning state and does not have institutions capable of doing things like drug regulation, or even, policing, streets, or enforcing property rights, or a lot of other things that our state actually does pretty effectively, if you want to see what bad regulation is. Now, in the case, I mean, you mentioned the Tuskegee syphilis case. I mean, that's an interesting one because, we have actually very strong rules in this country regarding human experimentation that have gotten stronger over time. I mean, despite this anti-regulatory upsurge of the last generation, rules on human experimentation have actually been tightened up. And they were tightened up precisely in response to things like Willowbrook, thalidomide, the Tuskegee syphilis experiment, because people reacted, in horror to these abuses that had occurred by simply a kind of unregulated private market. Now, I think the challenge in these future biotechnologies is, to put into place a regulatory system that will have some effect before you have a big disaster. Thing is that it's always easy, the nuclear power industry now regulates itself like crazy, after 3 Mile Island, but it didn't see the necessity of doing that before 3 Mile Island. And I think that one of the big challenges is, to be able to anticipate really big problems before they happen. And unfortunately, if you look at the whole history of drug regulation, I mean, the FDA, for example, I mean, drug testing, was driven by this sulfonidamide elixir scandal in which over 100 children were poisoned by an unregulated drug back in the 1930s. And unfortunately, I mean, the real world experience is that you got to go through, a series of these things until you get, the right, political consensus in favor of regulation. But I dispute the general idea that regulation doesn't work. I mean, it works in a lot of cases, and it's a question of just designing the right institutions and to have the right level of regulation, because you also don't want to hold back, valuable things as well.
Okay. I think we have time for just one more question, because we want to go upstairs and meet Dr. Fukuyama in person and buy his books. Now you're making it tough on me. I see 3 hands. Let's go with the gentleman right smack in the center of the 1/3 of the way back here. Let's go here, and I'll tell you what. Well, I will go to the woman next to him after that.
Dr. Fukuyama, in regards to what you mentioned about Pat Buchanan's book, and if you agree that his demographics are correct, but you don't agree with his ultra-nationalist recommendations, or those of someone like Le Pen for keeping things as they are now, how would you suggest that with cultures moving in that are anti-Western or anti-modernization, how would you preserve a liberal democracy which you value so highly without making liberal democracy itself something that has to be applied in such a fashion? It's almost as if democracy itself becomes a fascist movement. Anything else has to be removed.
Well, I think you do that through education. I mean, in the early 20th century, the public school system in the United States was used not just to transmit skills and knowledge, it was also used to, deliberately, I think, to socialize all of these, millions of new immigrants that were coming in from southern Italy or from, the former Tsarist Empire, different parts of Europe, China, and so forth, and Americanizing them. And I think one of the big problems in the United States now is with the rise of things like multiculturalism and bilingualism. Instead of, being kind of self-confident about American values and trying to socialize people, regardless of race and national origin, to that set of standards, we now celebrate, everybody's remaining culturally different, which I think is not, I think that you can only have a successful immigration policy if you also try to, to assimilate people. And I don't think it has to be done with fascist methods. I think, you say very clearly, you revive things like civics, and teach people about basic political values. And, I think that's the way that you do that. And the country, I think, is sufficiently attractive as a society that you don't have to hit people over the head with that. I really do think that you can do it in a much more, kind of appealing and attractive fashion.
Okay, and our last, I think people like that. And our last question, please.
I just wonder if you would address the stem cell issue, especially since so many Nobel Scientist Prize winners have addressed it and endorsed it, and the research.
Well, I, was in favor of stem cell research under the guidelines that the NIH had set up, which was that, they, in deference to, I mean, I'm not pro-life personally, but I think that it's reasonable in a country where you got a substantial number of people that feel very strongly about that it was quite reasonable that you would permit stem cell research under certain conditions, that they be taken from leftover embryos from IVF clinics and with, informed consent and so on and so forth. Where I think the problem, and so I was quite happy, with those rules and President Bush's decision. By the way, I'm speaking just on my own behalf. I'm not speaking, I am a member of his Bioethics Council, but the council has a lot of diverse views, and I'm not speaking in their name. I think his decision was a little bit more restrictive than I would have preferred, but I thought it was, a reasonable position to take. The more difficult one is the cloning legislation that's currently before the Congress, which seeks to ban both reproductive cloning, that is to say, cloning to produce a child, and in one version would also ban so-called therapeutic or research cloning. Now, my position, I have supported the broader ban for a very specific reason, which is that I do think that it is a big step to take to deliberately create a cloned embryo only for research purposes. That I do not believe that an embryo has the moral status of an infant, but it is definitely something very human. And it's a line that we ought to cross, I think, very cautiously. And while people would be willing to extract stem cells from embryos, I'm not so sure that, they would, how they'd feel about, 5 years from now if you decided you had to extract entire organs or tissues from a fetus, that was 3 or 4 months old, grown deliberately, for that purpose. And so I'm, a little bit worried about the precedents that we're setting in doing this. And so actually my own preference is that if we permit this so-called therapeutic cloning to go ahead, that it be encased in a lot of, in a regulatory system that will prevent us from sliding down that particular slippery slope.
Well, thank you, Dr. Francis Fukuyama.
Thank you.
Please join us upstairs. There's cookies and coffee and, of course, books and our special guest to say hello to personally.
Francis Fukuyama is the author of The End of History and the Last Man, Trust, and the Great Disruption. His latest, Our Posthuman Future, is published by Fair, Strauss, and Giroux, online at fsgbooks.com.